Okay, 24 July, 2025, dis&datInformation. We're continuing to look at the volume by Campbell and Reuten on Karl Marx's Capital Volume III. This is chapter 5. The book is the culmination of Capital essays on Volume 3 of Marx's Capital. This particular chapter, chapter number 5, is Transformation and the Monetary Circuit. Marx as a monetary theorist of production. Ricardo Bellafiore. In fact, the seller of labor power, like the seller of any other commodity, realizes its exchange value and alienates its use value. He cannot take the one without giving the other. The use value of labor power, in other words, labor, belongs just as little to its seller as the use value of oil after it has been sold belongs to the dealer who sold it. The owner of the money has paid the value of a day's labor power. He therefore has the use of it for a day. A day's labor belongs to him. On the one hand, the daily sustenance of labor power costs only half a day's labor, while on the other hand, the very same labor power can remain effective, can work during a whole day, and consequently the value which its use during one day creates is double what the capitalist pays for that use. This circumstance is a piece of good luck for the buyer, but by no means an injustice toward the seller. Section 1, Introduction. One of the more debated issues in Marxian theory is the relationship between Volume 1 and Volume 3 of Capital. Indeed, since the publication of Volume 3, the thesis according to which there is a contradiction between the two books has been one of the favorite arguments of Marx's critics. The main point is, of course, Marx's presumed failure to transform exchange values into prices of production. The charges have been repeated again and again over the last century, beginning with Borkowitz and Dmitriev and ending with contemporary neoclassicals like Paul Samuelson or neo-Ricardians like Ian Steedman. While Marx thought that exchange values were the necessary starting points in the deduction of prices of production, these critics maintain that exchange values are redundant. Prices, including a uniform rate of profit among industries, can be reached directly with the technological matrix and the real wage taken as givens. A second contradiction between the two volumes can be detected, a contradiction which has been little explored in associated literature as it is just less evident. What I'm referring to here is the notion of money, which Marx puts forward in the first chapters of Volume 1, as against the notion of money underlying Volumes 2 and 3. In Volume 1, money is introduced as a special commodity, a product of labor. In these early chapters, Marx's inquiry is concerned with the general exchange of commodities, from which he derives money as the universal equivalent. In Volume 3, the cycle, or circuit, of capital has as its first step the financing of industrial capitalist production by monetary capitalists. Yet, a heterodox tradition in monetary thought dating back to the beginning of the century, and having among its prominent advocates Wicksell, Schumpeter, and Keynes, states that money opening the circuit of capital cannot have the nature of a commodity, but is rather that of a pure symbol. Today, this sign -money is bank money created ex nihilo. However, even gold money of the good old days had to be interpreted, to quote Keynes's well-known dictum, as a banknote printed on gold. Since the 1970s, the first contradiction has produced an uninterrupted and unending flood of books and papers, mainly by neo-Ricardians, all scrutinizing Marx after Strophe. The usual outcome is that the labor theory of value must be rejected, although a divide exists between those like Gariani, who hold that giving up the labor theory of value does not damage Marx's conclusions, and those like Steedman, who hold that the questionable theory is fundamental to Marx's edifice, which, as a consequence of Piero Strophe's 1960 book, crumbles together with its faulty foundations and must be rebuilt from scratch. Both positions entail a negative judgment of the labor theory of value as a theory of exploitation, Volume 1, needless for Gariani, wrong for Steedman, and as a theory of production prices, Volume 3, happily rescued by Strophe, who goes beyond Marx's errors. Alternatively, the second contradiction has been underlined in the 1980s by those who, like the present writer, insist upon the utility of reading Marx after Schumpeter, embracing especially the credit theory of money spelled out in his theory of economic development. According to this minority view, sign money, sign-money, can be reconciled with the labor theory of value. The argument requires clear qualification against parallel monetary readings of Marx's oeuvre. These other readings, while shifting the focus of attention from production prices to market prices, and hence reducing the emphasis on the first contradiction, end up claiming that a rejection of Marx's commodity theory of money empties his notion of exploitation of any meaning. In the course of this chapter, I, Belfiore, definitely will not establish what Marx really meant. On the contrary, my point of departure is that Marx's project cannot be defended as it stands, and that some of the contradictions on which the critics have insisted are really there in Capital. Now, what I want to show is that in spite of the presence of some breaches in Marx's project, a core in his critique of political economy, which is also a critical political economy, can be picked out, and a firm grasp of this core enables Marx's progression from Volume 1 to Volume 3 to be reestablished on a sound theoretical basis. The core is the labor theory of value as a theory of the origin of capitalist surplus before it is a theory of price determination. This theory is strengthened rather than weakened by the shift to a monetary theory of production, where the cycle of capital is seen as a monetary sequence opened by bank finance, even if this move does compel us to revise some steps in Marx's original train of thought. Belfiore specifically shows how a bank credit theory of exploitation, allows us to regain the priority of exchange values in the determination of prices of production for methodological reasons, thus paralleling Marx's approach to the transformation. Contrary to some quote-unquote new approaches, this reading of Marx highlights that the rate of surplus value in Volume 1 before the transformation is the same as the rate of surplus value in Volume 3, but is different from the gross money profit / money wages ratio as a ratio between the labor equivalents of these money magnitudes after the transformation. Section 2, the origin of surplus value. Now, a good place to start is Part 3, Chapter 7 of Capital, Volume 1. The sale and purchase of labor power is over, and we now enter into the capitalist labor process as the arena where value and surplus value are created. To understand how the valorization process goes on, Marx follows a form of reasoning based on the method of comparison. Since the matter is a controversial one, it is best to quote Marx at length. Marx shows us an amusing dialogue of our would-be capitalist with himself. The givens in the argument are the methods of production, the level of employment, the intensity and productive power of each worker, and the real wage. To begin with, imagine that a capitalist makes wage earners work just the time needed to reproduce their labor power, including the replacement of the means of production. At this point, our capitalist, says Marx, stares in astonishment. The value of the product is equal to the value of the capital advanced. the value advanced has not been valorized. That is, no surplus value has been created, and consequently, money has not been transformed into capital. Please note that in this quote and those following, I've reintroduced italics missing from the original English translation. 2 pages later, he goes on, quote, the capitalist paid to the worker a value of 3 shillings, and the worker gave him back an exact equivalent in the value of 3 shillings he added to the cotton. He gave him value for value, close quote. But the capitalist's surprise is short-lived. Indeed, it was a joke. Quote, let us examine the matter more closely. The value of a day's labor power amounts to 3 shillings because, on our assumption, half a day's labor is objectified in that quantity of labor power, i.e., because the means of subsistence required every day for the production of labor power cost half a day's labor. But the past labor embodied in the labor power and the living labor it can perform, that is the daily cost of maintaining labor power and its daily expenditure in work, are 2 totally different things. The former determines the exchange value of the labor power. The latter is its use value. The fact that half a day's labor is necessary to keep the worker alive during 24 hours does not in any way prevent him from working a whole day. Therefore, the value of labor power and the value which that labor power valorizes in the labor process are 2 entirely different magnitudes. And this difference was what the capitalist had in mind when he was purchasing the labor power, close quote. Now, what matters here is the analytic distinction between labor and labor power, the pivot of Marx's critique of classical political economy. It is thanks to this distinction that the origin of the capitalist surplus that Bellafiore is called the originary profits elsewhere may be explained. Quote, our capitalist foresaw this situation, and that was the cause of his laughter. The worker therefore finds in the workshop the means of production necessary for working not just 6, but 12 hours. The trick has at last worked. Money has been transformed into capital. The process of valorization is nothing but the continuation of the process of creating value beyond a definite point. If the process is not carried beyond the point where the value paid by the capitalist for the labor power is replaced by an exact equivalent, it is simply a process of creating value. But if it is continued beyond that point, it becomes a process of valorization, close quote. Now, in Marx's argument, we compare 2 very different outlooks. The first is the situation where living labor, i.e., the abstract labor which is going to be embodied in the output, does not exceed necessary labor, i.e., the abstract labor embodied in the equivalent of the wage goods given over to workers. Though hypothetical, this situation is meaningful and real, since a vital capitalist production process needs to reintegrate the capital advance to reproduce the working population at the historically given standard of living. In this Marxian analog of Schumpeter's circular flow, there would be no surplus value and hence no profits, and commodities would exchange at relative ratios given by their relative exchange values. Now, when Marx proceeds to the second term of the comparison, which corresponds to what actually happens in production during the current period's valorization process as a result of the antagonism between capital as a whole and the working class, he examines the lengthening of the working day beyond the point that is necessary according to the first outlook. Living labor now surpasses necessary labor as the abstract labor embodied in the means of subsistence required every day for the production of labor power. Now, as a consequence of surplus labor, the capitalist surplus value sees the light of day. Not to muddle up his inquiry into the origin of surplus value in the capitalist labor process with his inquiry over its redistribution among the industries where it was extracted, redistribution which is due to competition between single capitals, Marx sticks to the same rule governing relative prices within the circular flow. Hence, both outputs and inputs are, for the moment, computed from exchange values attaching simple prices to the various commodities. It's crystal clear that this view has nothing to do with the idea that the labor theory of value gives an adequate picture of a simple commodity production stage historically preceding the capitalist stage. Rather, the abstract labor theory of value is a logical device Marx adopts to show why surplus value is nothing other than surplus labor. The comparison Marx makes is not between a situation where the wages of petty commodity producers exhaust income and a situation where capitalists are present and making profits out of a proportional reduction in wages. It is, rather, between two actual capitalist situations where the determining factor is the continuation of the social working day, holding constant, of course, the given price rule. There is, however, in a very special sense, a historical element behind Marx's argument, but not the one stressed by Engels, nor the historical transformation problem advanced by, Ronald Meek and others. It is rather the sequential nature of the capitalist monetary process within each period, the sequential nature of the capitalist monetary process within each period. That is, the time implicit in the chain of successive phases going on during the monetary circuit. I will say more on this later. What is important now is to understand that Marx's comparison is affected not only when absolute surplus value is first pumped out, but at the end of each capitalist monetary circuit, and that this compels us to go back to exchange values as the ruling prices. Now, the crucial role of the method of comparison we're referring to may be measured also by the central role it plays in Marx's critique of Ricardo in the Theories of Surplus Value, Volume 2, Chapter 15. In Part A, Section 2, called Surplus Value, Marx writes, quote, "The total working day is greater than that part of the working day which is required for the production of the wages." Why? That does not emerge in Ricardo. The magnitude of the total working day is therefore wrongly assumed to be fixed. But it is equally obvious that if, with a given labor time, a given length of the working day, the productivity of labor may be very different, on the other hand. With a given productivity of labor, the labor time, the length of the working day, may be very different. Furthermore, it is that though the existence of surplus labor presupposes that the productivity of labor has reached a certain level, the mere possibility of this surplus labor, i.e., the existence of that necessary minimum productivity of labor, does not in itself make it a reality. For this to occur, the laborer must first be compelled to work in excess of the necessary time, and this compulsion is exerted by capital. Close quote. The passage quoted suggests that in each valorization process, the mere possibility of surplus labor given by some presupposed level of the productive power of labor becomes a reality only through capitalist control, i.e., it must be realized through a social element, the forced and other directed nature of the living labor of wage workers. Punch clock, maybe. I cannot pursue this thread here to show that in the Marxian argument, with the real subsumption of labor to capital, the technical possibility of surplus labor is shown to depend on, to be the posit of the social condition of labor in the production process. So for development of this argument, see my papers quoted in footnote 7, which goes back to several pages. Anyway, right here. This, oh gosh, well, he states the difference between his point of view and Rubin's point of view. Anyway. All right, sorry. In volume 1, each firm is seen as just a fraction of total capital. The pumping out of living labor in each capitalist labor process leads in the aggregate to a division of the social working day into two magnitudes. That is, the necessary labor hidden behind the wage goods, which are made available to the working class, and the surplus labor hidden behind what we may call profit goods, the capital goods or the consumption goods taken over by the capitalist class. This macro social sharing of the current value added by workers is accurately reflected in the rate of surplus value as the ratio of the simple price of profit goods over the simple price of wage goods. That is, in the ratio of the surplus labor embodied in profit goods over the necessary labor embodied in wage goods, which are the result of production. This is why the same, for example, well, we call it chassis, can be brand engineered into a variety of more luxury versions of the same car, let's say. Section 3, the value of money and the value of labor power. It looks like quite a clear-cut argument. It isn't. That is Bellafiore, have omitted essential elements in Marx's approach. So let us then complete the picture. The first qualifications touch on the problematic identity between embodied labor coefficients and magnitudes of value we posed before. The problems here are two. The first is that the living labor of wage workers is, before exchange, only a potential value. At the beginning of capital, when the analysis is still limited to the presupposition of a general exchange of commodities, abstract labor is private labor becoming social labor on the market. When the unfolding of the argument shows that exchange may be general only with capital, the private labors externally connected in actual exchange are shown not to be the labors of private independent producers, but the labors organized by capitalist firms. The capitalist organization of production marks out abstract labor as a bet on sociality made by the individual industrial capitalist, a pre-commensuration of labor in advance of final exchange, which in its turn, has to be ante-validated by the monetary capitalist in advance of production. That bet, of course, has to be submitted to the further eventual validation of the commodity market. Not only does the labor time spent in production count insofar as it is the socially necessary labor time for the production of use values, it must also correspond to social need. Marx assumes all along in Volume 1, and for much of the other two volumes, including the transformation problem, that the potential value in production will be really actualized in final exchange. On the basis of this hypothesis, the living labor of the wage worker spent in the sphere of production, which strictly speaking is only potential abstract labor, is considered to be fully realized on the commodity market. The second problem concerns the unity of production and circulation. Again, in the first chapters of Capital, the book, before introducing capital into the picture, the metamorphosis of abstract labor into social labor is not effected through the direct exchange of the commodity against other commodities, but through the indirect exchange of the commodity with money as the universal equivalent. Money here is considered as a very special commodity. Once more, it is important to quote Marx's own words at this stage. Quote, products of labor would not become commodities were they not products of separate private labors carried on independently of one another. The social interconnection of these private labors exists materially insofar as they're members of a natural, spontaneous social division of labor, and hence, through their products, satisfy wants of different kinds, in the totality of which the similarity, that is, natural, spontaneous system of social wants, consists. This material social interconnection of private labors, carried on independently of one another, is, however, only mediated, and hence is realized only through the exchange of their products. The product of private labor, hence, only has social form insofar as it has value form, and hence the form of exchangeability with other products of labor. It has immediately social form insofar as its own bodily or natural form is at the same time the form of its exchangeability with other commodities or counts as value form for other commodities. However, as we've seen, this only takes place for a product of labor when, through the value relation of other commodities to it, it is in equivalent form, or with respect to other commodities, plays the role of equivalent. Close quote. Gold as the product of labor, which plays the role of the universal equivalent, which plays the role of the universal equivalent, counts as the value form for other commodities, and hence it has immediately social form. The interopposition between use value and value within the commodity develops into an external opposition. The equivalent commodity counts as value form, the shape of exchange value, while the other commodity counts as the shape of use value. As a consequence, the concrete labor producing money as a commodity is immediately not private but social labor. It is the form of actualization of abstract labor. Gold as money is a commodity in the sense of being produced by labor. It is not a commodity in the sense of this expression. Value is private labor validated in exchange, whereas money does not need to be validated almost by definition. Rather, money as the material symbol of abstract labor represents value in its own bodily or natural form. Major consequences follow from this view of value in money. The magnitude of potential value within a commodity can be traced back to embodied labor merely as a share of the labor producing money as a commodity. On the market, the monetary expression of labor time tells us how many units of money, and hence of directly social labor, a unit of private, indirectly social labor, time spent in producing commodities is able to buy. It is the sum of prices divided by the labor time pumped out in production. The value of money is the reciprocal, i.e., the amount of directly social, as opposed to private, indirectly social labor embodied in the production of money as a commodity. This allows Marx to translate labor embodied in commodities into observable money magnitudes in the market, as the quotes in the second section of this chapter make clear. Marx's commodity theory of money is relevant also to understanding his notion of the value of labor power in Capital Volume I. Marx is well aware that the wage is paid in money by the capitalist to the worker before entering production, and that the latter has to wait after the end of production until he will spend the wage on the commodity market, confirming the real wage. The labor embodied in the real consumption basket of the worker is therefore unidentified before the valorization process. Marx, however, claims the opposite. The owner of money, he stresses, has already paid the value of labor power on the labor market. Now, Marx is quite right in taking this position. Variable capital is money capital, which can be thought of as gold, that is, an amount of directly social labor embodied that is given before the valorization process. If the real wage is at the subsistence level, a level which is determined by historical and moral elements, and hence by class conflict, the labor embodied in the gold buying labor power at the beginning corresponds to a given amount of the abstract labor embodied in the wage goods bought by the worker. There is a bidirectional mapping between the money equivalent of labor power and the value of labor power, both being reducible to embodied labors. As a consequence, in this monetary perspective, Marx's application of his method of comparison appears to have this structure. Part 1, at the beginning of the circuit, the would-be capitalist advances the value of labor power in money, i.e. gold, with a given labor content, which corresponds to the value of labor power because the capitalist class will in fact supply on the market at the end of the circuit the subsistent wages the working class expects. Part 2. If the laborers' work lasts until their living labor reaches the necessary labor embodied in the money, i.e. gold, advanced, the owner of money would not become a capitalist. Exchange values would be the ruling prices. Part 3. The would-be capitalist is actually a smart capitalist. He compels workers to expend living labor exceeding the necessary labor embodied in the money, that is gold, advanced, hence creating surplus abstract labor. Number 4. When the capitalist goes to the commodity market, he gets back a larger sum of money, hence a larger amount of labor embodied in gold. That's the universal equivalent. The surplus value is nothing other than the surplus labor contained in the extra money and corresponds to a certain amount of actualized abstract labor coming from production. Number 5, the real wage gained by the worker after production is equal to the value which the special commodity labor power deserves in this mode of production because it is the labor time needed for the production and reproduction of this specific article, a value which, according to Marx, in a given country and in a given period is a datum, right? Because of the causality chain, the value of money is given at the beginning of the circuit. It's because the value of money is already given that variable capital may be expressed both in labor and in money before production, and that the living labor of wage workers may be expressed both in labor and in money before the final exchange on the commodity market. Now, 2 objections may be raised against this train of thought. Well, let's start from the end. The correspondence of the labor embodied in money as a commodity with the labor embodied in the consumption bundle of the wage worker we mapped in the previous argument is, of course, valid only within equal exchange, namely with relative prices proportional to relative exchange values, or with money prices at simple prices. When production prices diverging from simple prices emerge, the labor bought on the commodity market by the money wage paid in gold and the labor embodied in the production of wage goods will not, in general, correspond. Here we come against a consequence of the first contradiction we recalled in the introduction of this chapter. I shall return to it. Bellafiore will return to it in the next section. The other charge goes to the heart of the matter. Can money be coherently depicted as a product of labor, as a special commodity in a monetary production economy like Marx's capitalism? My answer is negative. In a monetary economy based on wage labor, the production both of consumption goods and of capital goods must be financed with money. The sequence is opened by the exchange between capital and labor on the labor market. Firms buy the labor power they need in view of the output they plan to sell after production. The dealing between firms and workers is a standard labor contract in money, and the general means of payment to firms to fulfill their obligation is provided by the banks. Production is the intermediate step, and it takes time. For the sake of simplicity, I assume that production begins at the same moment and lasts one period for each firm. After production, at the closing of the circuit, the commodity market opens. Consumption goods are sold to the workers against their money wage, whereas the rest of the output remains inside the firm sector, either as capital goods for productive use or as consumption goods for personal use. Thus, in a closed economy, initial finance from banks is necessary in order that firms are able to acquire labor power and intermediate goods. The expenditure for intermediate goods disappears in aggregate for firms, and the initial finance needed by the capitalist class reduces to the wages bill. If money is the outcome of this production process, the gold producer, where does the money financing the production of money as a commodity come from? This question and the related one, where should the extra money paying for surplus value come from, was posed by Rosa Luxemburg with good theoretical insight. Unfortunately, she lost her way in the fog of the gold producer on the former question and gave only a partial and incorrect answer to the latter question, referring to the money coming into the commodity market from quote-unquote external sources. As Schumpeter clearly saw, and Wicksell before him, The problem can be satisfactorily answered only if finance to production means bank loans created ex nihilo with money interpreted as a pure symbol. Money interpreted as a pure symbol. The second contradiction, recalled in my introduction, reappears. If money has no labor content, then the Marxian notion of exploitation may seem to get in trouble. Without money as a commodity, it is impossible to establish the labor counterpart of a variable capital as an advance of money before production and to calculate before final exchange the amount of surplus labor embodied in the extra money the firm is struggling for. Indeed, the very notion of extra money becomes dubious for reasons I will not go into now. From production, we can grasp only living labor as indirect social labor. To know the division of the social working day, we have to wait until gross profits and wages are spent on the commodity market. In an inconvertible paper money system, the value of money and the value of labor power will be fixed only at the end of the monetary circuit. Hence, critics argue Marx's chain of causality collapses. Section 4. The transformation of exchange values into prices of production, another interpretation. Bellafiore doesn't think that replacing Marx's money as a commodity with a credit theory of money gives such negative results. Before trying to solve the second contradiction, however, we need to deal with the first one, namely the claim put forward by neoclassicals and neo-Ricardians alike that the shift from equal exchange to unequal exchange dissolves the labor theory of value. In this section, Bellafiore intends to show that how the transformation can be seen as the consequential logical development in Volume 3 of the theory of value interpreted as a theory of the origin of surplus value developed in Volume 1, and that a reappraisal of the transformation a century later disproves the positions of critics and fundamentalists alike. In the following section, I'll refer to this so-called new interpretation, underlining how particular definitions of the value of money and of the value of labor power break with crucial points in Marx's argument. And in the sixth section of this chapter, Bellafiore returns to the issue of exploitation within the capitalist monetary sequence and discuss to what extent the notion of surplus labor as the ground of the capitalist surplus is fully confirmed by the theory of the monetary circuit, with a logical prior determination of the rate of surplus value relative to the rate of profit. Now, let us go back to the argument that Marx uses to explain the birth of surplus value from surplus labor. In the logical order of that argument, capital cannot be presupposed in itself. As reference to the method of comparison shows, Marx has to start from a situation where surplus value is assumed away. At the same time, in the temporal sequence of the capitalist process, the metamorphosis between labor and capital on the labor market precedes the production of capitalist commodities to be sold on the market. Hence, exchange on the labor market constitutes the capitalist process in a double meaning, being introduced before capital is explained. The inputs to the valorization process have to be considered as mere commodities, and this affects also the valuation of the wage goods that make up the subsistence bundle, that is, those wage goods which determine the value of the labor power at the beginning of the circuit. Commodities may be deduced as capitalist commodities only after exchange on the labor market. It is as a consequence of the double social relationship in the labor market and in the capitalist labor process that capital is produced. The former alone is not enough. Consideration of the latter is essential. To have capital as the output of the production process, the inputs bought by money capital have to be initially conceived as not capitalist commodities. The two-step argument in Capital Volume 1, which explains the origin of surplus value and thereby of capital, is prolonged in the two-step transformation Marx suggests in Volume 3. As I've shown in the second section of this chapter, Bellafiore, Volume 1 relative prices are equal to relative exchange values, and money prices to simple prices, because these are the prices proper to the situation of circular flow. That is the first side of the comparison. And because when the ideal lengthening of working time gives way to surplus value, that is the second side of the comparison, which is nothing other than the actual situation, surplus value is not immediately distributed to individual industries. When we go on to the analysis of the redistribution of surplus value among competing capitals, we need to take into account that the individual capitalist is interested in the ratio between the excess in the value of a product over the capital advanced, and that a tendency towards the formation and equalization of the profit rate is imminently built into the abstract nature of capitalist wealth. Our inquiry must then deal with the issue of the determination of relative prices, which allow for an equal rate of profit and of money prices as production prices, and to ask if those relative prices, which in general differ from relative exchange values, and those production prices, which in general differ from simple prices, are compatible with the labor theory of value. The deduction of prices of production is, in Marx, effected once again through a mediation, which, first of all, aims at explaining the formation of the category in question, the general rate of profit, and afterwards look at the feedbacks of the new category on the theoretical structure. The formation of the general rate of profit is tackled by Marx in strict continuity with the first two-step comparison in Volume 1. He starts by asking how prices of the capitalist output, allowing for an equal rate of profit, are determined. Since in Volume 1, the inputs had to be accounted for as mere commodities when explaining the origin of surplus value, Marx begins his construction of the general rate by connecting total surplus value with total capital advance, the numerator and the denominator still being computed in simple prices. Now, this is the general rate of profit as it's introduced in Volume 3, Part 2, Chapter 9. Through the application of this rate of profit to advanced capital, computed at simple prices, Marx reaches for the first time a capitalist price for output. Thus, the same commodity has a double exchange ratio. That is, it is valued at simple prices when it is looked at as an input, and at production prices when it is looked at as an output. To examine the feedbacks, we must subsequently apply the capitalist price of the outputs to the inputs, as Marx himself suggests. If we iterate the procedure, we reach the Schraffian simultaneous solution for a reproduction equilibrium, where relative prices, which include a uniform profit rate, reestablish the originary distribution of the commodities. Now, therefore, input prices and output prices are the same. Now, before making further comment on Marx after Schraffa, let me stress that here we have another application of the method of comparison. The first step of the second comparison, where the rate of profit a la Marx and the prices of capitalist output are set, is another theoretical construction whose function is to provide a bridge between the first comparison in Volume 1, which discovers surplus labor behind the capitalist surplus, to the second step of the second comparison, which extends the transformation to the inputs as suggested in Volume 3. It is possible, in this way, to isolate the object of analysis of Volume 1, that is, the production of surplus value, the origin of the capitalist surplus, taking fully into account the unity of production and circulation, and without severing the links with the redistribution of surplus value in circulation. Now, once again, this theoretical construction in the second comparison is expressing something hypothetical but real, that is, the value rate of profit hidden behind its surface modified expression as the price rate of profit. Thus, the method whereby Marx tackles the problem is such that we move sequentially along two routes whose order cannot be reversed. We begin with an argument tracing capital back to labor. It is a linear, one-way road. Labor originates capital because capital compels labor power to perform a living labor greater than necessary labor. Capital here is the outcome of the argument. It's not the starting point. It is then justified theoretically to recognize the logical priority of labor over capital, and therefore recognize that inputs are not immediately taken to be capitalist commodities. Hence, the first valuation of the elements of constant and variable capital at simple prices. In this view, the determination of the general rate of profit in the way Marx accomplishes it in Volume 3 is quite straightforward. Now, subsequently, we must include the means of subsistence as well as the other inputs, and also outputs of capital's circular process. Once the originary profits have seen the light and the formation of the uniform rate of profit has been accounted for, prices of production and the general rate of profit must be simultaneously determined on the commodity market at the end of the circuit. This methodological sequentiality is fundamental to Marx. The rate of profit of the simultaneous solution would be meaningless if it were not grounded in the dynamics of production as the center of the valorization process. Through the value rate of profit in Chapter 9. If this point has been totally overlooked by the neo-Ricardians, where is the problem for the fundamentalists? The problem is that Marx is not at all clear that the rate of profit, as he computed it in Chapter 9, was not the end of the story. For example, that it was different from the one reached by iterating his procedure and converging to the simultaneous solution. He rather seems to assume that the two are identical. However, contrary to Marx's strictures, after Seaton and Sraffa, we know that prices of production can be set directly without starting from exchange values. An accounting of the conditions of production at simple prices is just redundant, in the precise sense that the last stage of the deduction of the prices of production cancels traces of all the previous steps. Finally, the simultaneous solution cannot confirm in one stroke the two famous equalities, that is, between the total value added in prices of production and in exchange values, and between gross profits and surplus value, through which Marx intends to show that the price changes merely redistribute value magnitudes and that the total of gross profits is merely the phenomenal form of the total of surplus labor. Now, according to Marx, not only is the rate of profit before and after the correction to inputs the same, but also the rate of surplus value and the gross money profit money wage ratio as a ratio between the labor equivalent of these monetary magnitudes should be equal. Now, the last charge has been countered by the new interpretation proposed by Dumenil and Foley. Now, I would like to take a closer look at the latter. Number 5, Section 5, the new interpretation. As we saw in the third section of this chapter, that Marx's argument in Capital, Volume 1, is framed in a monetary sequence economy where money was understood as a money commodity. Now, before going into the details of the new interpretation of the transformation of simple prices into prices of production, it may be helpful to sketch out how consideration of the monetary value, monetary nature of Marx's first comparison affects the issue. So, if we move from equal to unequal exchange, that is, if prices diverge from simple prices after the transformation, an hour of labor embodied in money as a commodity, i.e., an hour of directly social labor, buys in exchange a different magnitude of abstract labor, i.e., a different amount of indirectly social labor than before. The two definitions of the value of labor power given by Marx in Volume 1, labor bought for a given amount of the universal equivalent and the labor embodied in production in the given amount of the means of subsistence, become contradictory. It is, of course, quite meaningful to say that in both schemes there is an amount of labor contained in both in money and in commodity and in the wage goods bought by workers. But we reach different results in the transformation if either the former or the latter are held constant. We are indeed compelled to make a choice. Either we take as given the variable capital in money, that is, the hours of labor embodied in money as a commodity buying labor power, or we take as given the elements of variable capital, i.e., the hours of labor embodied in the production of the wage goods workers are able to buy. If we assume that finance to production is unchanged from the price to the value scheme, and if prices of production are higher or lower than simple prices, the amount of commodities bought by a given money wage will be lower or higher after the transformation. The necessary labor embodied in the means of subsistence will then be known only after the transformation, or if you like, the real wage now becomes an endogenous variable. Following this route, the hours of labor embodied in money as a commodity are the datum in the transformation, whereas the hours of labor embodied in the production of the wage goods the worker can buy are a function of the purchasing power of money as a commodity at the new prices. On the other hand, if we stick to the real wage as the exogenous variable, that is, the hours of labor embodied in the production of the wage goods the worker can buy, the production of the wage goods the worker can buy are the datum in the transformation. Since the wage bundle is given and the amount of money advanced as variable capital must then be adjusted to allow workers to buy the wage bundle in both schemes. The new interpretation is, in a sense, a generalization of the first route, the one in which the money wage is given, leading to a situation where money may not be a product of labor. In their solution, the normalization constraint is that the value added by actual living labor remains the same, both in exchange values and prices of production. The sum of variable capital and surplus value is therefore, by definition, identical to the sum of gross profits and wages in money. Now, what is essential in Marx, it's argued, that is, the value added exactly represents indirectly social labor time, a point on which, by the way, Bellafiore fully agrees. To express this view, the equation where living labor's monetary expression is set equal to the price of the net product takes the place of the Volume III equality between total prices and total values. The value of labor power is here meant to be the labor time equivalent of the money wage. We then need to know the value of money to know the value of labor power. Now, since money is not a commodity, the value of money bears no relation whatsoever to any notion of labor embodied in the universal equivalent, as it was for Marx. The value of money is now simply the amount of indirectly social labor time a unit of money represents, a magnitude which is indeed nothing more than the ratio of living labor over the value added in prices. Now, this means two things: that the value of money in this approach is set only at the end of the monetary circuit, when the net product meets the demand for commodities, consumption goods and new capital goods derived from money income, wages and profits, and that the aforementioned normalization constraint holds the value of money constant. At this point in the new interpretation, we're able to decipher the value of labor power as the money wage multiplied by the value of money. It is the amount of indirectly social labor time bought by the money wage, or what is the same thing, the share of the value added going to money wages. Since surplus value is defined as the value added less the value of labor power, surplus value is therefore just another name for gross money profits. Surplus value reduces to unpaid labor time, not to be sure the labor time embodied in the remainder of the net product after a given subsistence is granted to workers, but rather the labor time bought by nominal profits in exchange, the share of living labor, which does not go back to workers as an expenditure on wages. According to this approach, the equality between gross money profits and surplus value is said to confirm another essential claim of Marx, a point which follows directly from the definitions used and on which, by the way, I disagree as a fair interpretation of the core of Marx's theoretical project. So Bellafiore disagrees with this interpretation. The new interpretation has been a tremendous advance in Marxian economics. It breaks, however, with Marx's chain of causality. The value of money and the value of labor power are no longer given before the production process. Moreover, surplus value and the rate of surplus value are no longer determined before the general profit rate resulting from the transformation and before the exchange on the commodity market. The supporters of the new interpretation may retort that the approach they follow is compulsory once we recognize that money may not be a commodity, and that with unequal exchange, the dual definitions of the value of labor power present in Volume 1 cannot be held together. Bellafiore wants to prove the opposite in the next section. Transformation in a Sequence Monetary Economy, Part 6. Let us go back to Rosa Luxemburg's fundamental question: from where does money enter the capitalist process? This issue is still embarrassing for bourgeois general equilibrium theory, as the debate running down from Pontican to Arrow to Bro Hahn to Clower to overlapping generation models shows very clearly. It also seems neglected in recent Marxian economic thought, as the exclusive and prior focus on money as a measure of value and as a means of exchange confirms. Money is always thought of as already being there, just like human rights, for example. I have implicitly given a possible answer at the end of the third section of this chapter. Money comes in through banks, initial finance to capitalist production. Thanks to their privileged access to money capital lent by banks, industrial capitalists hold a power, not only over the determination of the level, but also over the composition of output. The capitalist class decides how many workers to employ, and where to allocate them. In this macro-social view, once firms as a whole have unconsciously chosen the share of their total labor power going to produce wage goods and the share going to produce profit goods, the real consumption of the working class is set. At the beginning of the monetary sequence, money capital, though valueless, is nevertheless a command over workers' labor time. Because of this monetary anti-validation, living labor is latently social even before the final exchange of the commodity market and the metamorphosis of commodities into the universal equivalent. See footnote 8. The value of money in this first step of the monetary circuit is the number of workers a unit of bank finance is able to buy. Given the methods of production and the productive power per worker, the length and intensity of the working day, and the employment level, we also know the living labor pumped out from these workers. I suggest calling the value of money as capital, that is capital, the ratio of the living labor over the wage bill, that is variable capital measured in money, period. From aggregate production, we can also establish the abstract labor embodied in both the profit goods and in the wage goods produced according to the firm's decisions about the composition of output and the allocation of workers. Now, all of this happens before and irrespective of any transformation of simple prices to prices of production, simply because the transformation problem opens up after the conditions of production, the inputs and outputs are set. The transformation problem is entirely placed at the level of dead labor, while the command of money capital affects living labor. The reference to labor in motion is necessary for Marx to explain how in capitalism, as the monetary economy par excellence, the surplus is extracted from workers. In this view, the given in the transformation issue should be the aggregate real wage. Of course, workers' real wages will be known only post factum on the commodity market. We may, as Marx did, proceed on the assumption that firms as a whole let workers take an aggregate subsistence wage bundle in which a certain amount of abstract labor time is embodied during its production. This I would suggest calling the value of labor power. We may then follow Marx in treating the value of labor power as given before the production process in a given country at a given period. Or we may consider the possibility that firms as a whole fix an aggregate real wage different from the subsistence bundle, in which a different amount of abstract labor is embodied during its production. This I suggest calling the price of labor power. The necessary labor for the working class is the labor embodied in the wage goods actually consumed by workers. With a price equal to the value of labor power, necessary labor is just the labor embodied in the subsistence bundle. Quote, the value of labor power can be resolved into the value of a definite quantity of the means of subsistence, close quote, i.e., the quantity of labor time required to produce them, as Marx says. Hence, we now know the rate of surplus value for the capitalist process as a whole as the ratio of surplus labor embodied in the production of profit goods over the necessary labor embodied in the production of wage goods. And we know this rate prior to production prices and the rate of profits. This rate of surplus value is computed according to the definition of the value of labor power at exchange values. When we go on to determine prices of production, we must take into account what happens to the value of money as capital and what happens to the value of labor power. Let me start. Bellafiore starts with the latter. The methods of production, the intensity and productive power of each worker in the real wage, but also the length of the social working day and the conditions of production, the level and composition of output and the inputs actually employed, the conditions of production are now the givens of the problem. With production prices different from simple prices, workers can consume the same wage bundle if only the value of labor power is reevaluated at the new prices. This means that the variable capital in money has to change. If the price of production of wage goods is higher or lower than their simple price, but the wage bill, or that is, the wage bill will increase or decrease as if banks' initial finance is going up or down. Since the wage bill is the denominator of the value of money as capital, and since living labor, the numerator, is unchanged, the value of money as capital in the price scheme is lower or higher after the transformation. It seems strange, but it's not. In fact, we are holding constant in the transformation both the purchasing power of initial finance in terms of the total living labor and the real cost of labor power needed by total capital to extract that living labor. This necessarily implies a change in the nominal magnitude of initial finance relative to the value scheme. In other words, money capital's command over labor time in Volume 3 has to be based on two givens. That is, the first given is the total social working day and necessary labor, which are the results of the inquiry into Volume 1 into the capital labor class struggle within production and the labor market. Two givens, the total social working day and necessary labor, which are the results of the inquiry in Volume 1 into the capital labor class struggle within production and labor market. But, of course, this imposes the development of a new category, the transformed value, or mutatis mutandis, the transformed price of labor power, i.e., or e.g., the real wage accounting in prices. Let us look at this point from another angle. Wage workers sell their labor power against the wage bill. Then there is a certain amount of money, sum of money the working class will spend on the commodity market. If we accept the normalization constraint of the new interpretation, we require the constancy of what Duncan Foley originally called the value of money, and that Bellafiore.
Mainly because, what rubric or what criteria are we, testing these individuals on to be able to see if they could be able to.
Let us look at this point from another angle. Wage workers sell their labor power against the wage bill. There is then a certain sum of money the working class will spend on the commodity market. If we accept the normalization constraint of the new interpretation, we require the constancy of what Foley originally called the value of money, and that I prefer to qualify as the value of money spent as income to distinguish it from the value of money as capital. However, I give a double valuation of labor power, first at exchange values, then at prices of production. Why? With the former valuation, I obtain the macro rate of surplus value as the ratio between the abstract labor embodied in the production of profit goods over the abstract labor embodied in the production of wage goods. With the latter valuation, I get the gross profit to wage, profit/wage ratio, as the ratio between the abstract labor represented in the money buying, the profit goods, over the labor represented in the money buying the wage goods. The meaning is quite clear. When wage goods are sold at the end of the circuit, they gain an amount of indirect social labor expressed by the wage bill after the transformation multiplied by the value of money as income. Now, since exchange is unequal, this amount is divergent from the abstract labor embodied in the production of those wage goods themselves, which may also be resolved in the amount of indirect social labor expressed by the wage bill before the transformation multiplied by the same value of money. The latter reveals what is obscured in the former, that is, the division of the social working day among classes. The real wage of the working class expressed at exchange values is more fundamental than the same real wage at prices of production. It is the end result of class struggle in the valorization process, which is hidden behind the circulation and distribution of commodities. Conclusion, finally. What is the relationship between this interpretation of the transformation and Marx's own approach? On the view I have proposed, Bellafiore has proposed here, the argument in exchange values is foundational because it gives an explanation of how the capitalist surplus stems from a prolongation of labor over the necessary labor embodied in the production of wage goods, as in Volume 1. The transformation of simple prices into production prices in Volume 3 means that the sole external input for firms as a whole, that is labor power, has to be valued according to a double exchange ratio to get the phenomenal, that is the gross profits to wage ratio as a ratio of labor equivalents, without losing sight of class relations in production. The logical priority of this macro analysis of the pumping out of labor and surplus labor over the micro determination of prices, linked as it is to temporal sequence within the monetary circuit from finance, that is labor power, to production, that is living labor, to exchange, dead labor, is what I see as the core of Marxian value theory. This core is fully respected in the alternative perspective I'm proposing. What is lost is the neat correspondence in Marx's argument between the rate of surplus value in the class economy as a whole and the rate of surplus value in each valorization process, since the latter changes if, within the given aggregate wage bundle, we allow workers the freedom to choose their personal consumption basket. So, neo-Ricardians and fundamentalists alike may retort that the eventual shape of the transformation, in my view, that is in Bellafiore's view, is once again the simultaneous solution loved by the former, hated by the latter. So what? The determination of prices on the commodity market is simultaneous. Value theory was for Marx also a theory of price determination. Value theory was for Marx also a theory of price determination. But this is a secondary aspect, the fundamental aspect being value theory as a theory of the origin of the capitalist surplus. Marx surely did not intend that the last stage in the transformation should cancel the previous one. But is it not a spectacular corroboration of his theory of fetishism that there is no trace of the reification process in the reified, so that we have the picture of a production of commodities by means of commodities? That capital as a circular process where current labor is already dead in the things and included in the means of subsistence conceals capital as the linear process where living labor produces the originary profits and hence capital itself. So, yes, I know this is very complicated and will require reading again, but Bellafiore's picking a somewhat small point, but it's one that talks about the time it takes. The transformation process is a temporal transformation, and it depends where you start drawing lines about things, and particularly the things that have not been defined early enough or explicated completely. That is, this relation between, if you assume labor, then you have to assume sort of it's, hypothesized, it's alive, and then it's dead. And if, you have to sort of assume that that's some kind of variable in this whole process. Anyway, I've exceeded my time. I will now, therefore, cut the live stream. Come on.